Where do I even begin? There is so much to discuss, talk about, and unpack when it comes to discussing this game. Which, by the way, at the time I'm making this, we are about to hit the 10-year anniversary of this game being released. And let's kind of do a little trip down memory lane, just to kind of help give some context, because, like I said, it's almost unavoidable to discuss Mass Effect 3 without talking about its history and the legacy that it has left almost 10 years later. The way people look back on this. And it's sometimes easy to forget what it was like leading up to it. At least unless you were there and heavily involved. Some were not, as we have seen many people have been discovering the series for the first time because of this edition. However, there are those of us like myself that do absolutely remember, because I was there. So like I said, Mass Effect 2 was a phenomenal hit. It was a smash. It was financially successful, it was highly acclaimed, very highly praised by players and critics in reviews, and as I mentioned, it even made a spot in a Smithsonian exhibit displaying the art of video games, of which only 100 were chosen, which, as I said, that's very impressive when you consider all the many games that could have been chosen for this, and Mass Effect 2 was chosen. So needless to say, because of the success of Mass Effect 2 being considered one of the best sequels and video games in general of all time, with the way that it carried over your choices in the first game, it had all the extremely the very well designed loyalty missions to really help you get more attached to the characters, and of course it all culminated in one of the best finales ever, the suicide mission. And of course it had the big teaser before the credits showing that the Reapers were coming. So needless to say, the hype for Mass Effect 3 was probably unlike anything else. Everyone was waiting for this game, dying to get their hands on this game, to find out anything, to try and hope for any leaks, get any information, hope that all the things that we speculated and theorized and theory crafted about was going to be able to come true and culminate in this, what was being advertised as the third and final chapter of this trilogy of this story involving Commander Shepard and the Reapers. And we were counting down the days, the weeks, the months. Literally, I distinctly remember, this is very true, I distinctly remember this. There was an app that I was able to get on my old phone that was literally, all it did was count down the minutes and the seconds till Mass Effect 3 was released. It had a counter for seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, and it was just counting down until Mass Effect 3 came out, which was going to be on March 6th, 2012. Like I said, at the time I'm making this in January of 2022, almost 10 years later. And I remember, one of the things I distinctly remember about this, I of course was so hyped to get this. And this was also during a time when a number of video games were doing those physical collector's editions. You guys remember those? Where you would they would come with like a statue or something, just, and other extra books or other just various different things you could collect. I distinctly remember these. Like, there was one for Skyrim when it came out that had a statue of Alduin on it. And some of them were pretty pricey. Like, some of them were around like $120 or, something, because of course you were getting like an extra statue or something with it. So of course that drove the price up. The collector's edition for Mass Effect 3, because there was one, it was only an extra $20. And it came with a plethora of extra in-game stuff. It also came with a character for this game that was a pre-order only day one DLC issue, which I'll talk about in a moment. And I think if I recall correctly, it also had a metal case and an art book and I think a comic book, which is stuff that came with the second game as well. But, the main thing was that I think it also came with a soundtrack as well. And like I said, a number of extra in-game things, which was one of always the draws for me. Not the extra physical stuff, but stuff you could actually have in the game itself, which is what appealed to me. So to help kind of cover the cost for this, I had, at the time, a ton of PlayStation 2 games, a lot of which I just didn't play anymore. So you know what I did? I packed them all into a duffel bag, and I went to my local GameStop at the time, and I traded in a whole bunch of those PlayStation 2 games. This was back when they were still taking PlayStation 2 games, because they were still selling them as pre-owned and such, and got a whole bunch of store credit to cover, I'd say, a good majority for that collector's edition, then I just kind of covered the rest. So, obviously I waited, and it kind of lined up very nicely to be able to... that night, I so remember that night. I was clear the rest of the week, at least for the next couple of days, 2 or 3 days, after it was going to come out. So I was going to have plenty of time to just play the game. And I remember going down there like a couple of hours early, and there was this van there in the parking lot that was like this special kind of party van that you could be able to request to come to like certain events. And it had like consoles in there that people could just go in and play while waiting for the game to be released at midnight. And I remember, as it got closer to midnight, we all started lining up. And what's funny is I remember there was another game coming out. It was a Tekken game. And I was joking with some people how many people in this line are here for Tekken and not Mass Effect. Just because the idea of that amused me. That Mass Effect, one of the highest, most anticipated games ever, was coming out. And people were there for something else, you know? And I picked it up and I got home as fast as I could. Put the disc in, have it installed, put in all the codes for all the DLC, and stayed up quite a bit. I think I was up till maybe like 8 or 9 in the morning, just playing before I went to sleep. However, let's talk about one of the first problems that should have been a red flag right from the get-go, and was for some people. There is a character in this game. I'm just going to go ahead and give it away. Javik the Prothean. He was a pre-order bonus, which meant he was also a Day 1 DLC. For those who don't know what that means he was already into the game, and he was on the disc when you bought it from Day 1. But unless you pre-order the game, he wasn't part of it. If you didn't pre-order, you had to spend, I think, another $5 to unlock his content in the game. EA, right? But yeah, this was one of the first early cases of that being a big issue. I distinctly remember Total Biscuit, may he rest in peace, boycotted this game because of that. Because he didn't want to support that practice of Day 1 DLC. Having Javik literally locked out of the game for players who didn't pre-order this game. And I couldn't fault him for that. It's a horrible practice. I absolutely despise that. And I'm so glad that that's not an issue with this new edition, that players now don't have to be concerned about that. That all the content is unlocked with this edition, which is great. Fantastic. But that should have been the first sign that something was up, something was wrong. Looking back on it, though, there was other stuff. Like, there was some advertisement material that really should have helped give it an idea that this may not have been the game that we were hoping for. So, let's just say that after a few days, because, as I said, I was playing that game quite a bit over the next few days. Trying to go through it and experience it as much as I could and enjoy it. And for the most part, I did. There are moments in this game that I think are legit good. And to this day, people are still getting emotional over those moments. It's been interesting watching people get emotional over moments that I remember getting emotional about the first time I played it. You guys know which scenes I'm talking about if you played this game. But then the big issue came up. After a few days, it was at that point everyone was starting to beat the game. And that's when the problems really start to get more vocal. That's when the word starting really spreading around to everyone about one of the biggest problems and issues. The last 10 minutes of this game. The ending. Or rather, should I say, the endings. And soon the meme of red, green, and blue started popping up everywhere. I remember there was a meme of people sending red, green, and blue cupcakes to BioWare to represent the 3 choices that you got at the end of the third game. The reaction was very strong. I cannot remember a reaction to something in gaming history as strong as the way people reacted to the ending of Mass Effect 3. People were irate. They were so vehement. People beat the game, and then some never came back. They were so devastated and disappointed by the horrible original ending. And I'm going to say it, the original ending was absolutely terrible. I absolutely agree. I remember sitting there after I beat the game the first time thinking, that's it? After all of that, that is it? That was one of my first initial reactions to being it. And I just started trying to go around to others to hear what their reactions were, to find out more information, to see what was going on. What was the response to all this? And I remember also at the time, people were demanding to BioWare to change the ending, to fix it. How can you give us this as our finale to this franchise? This is horrible. This is absolutely terrible and unfair. How can you do this? And at the time, they were actually trying to somewhat defend it. Though I think I've heard years later they actually got into more detail about the horrible conditions that they were under to try and get this out. Which, yeah, I'm sure the conditions of trying to get this out as fast as they could without giving it the proper time that it needs was not great. Of course, we've learned more so about what happened behind the scenes when it came to how things were being run, the amount of issues with staff and personnel, the writing changes, mainly changes to the writing personnel, the people who had been writing the first couple of games. There was changes there, which of course had an effect on the story of this game. When you change writers, yeah, that's going to have an effect. And, it's always a shame to find out those details that happen behind the scenes when it comes to games like these, hoping and wishing that things had been different because things probably would have turned out differently. It's, and it's such a shame. Now, it was all anyone was talking about. For months, everyone was talking about how, and discussing whether or not it not only ruined the game, but ruined the entire franchise. I know, like I said, at the time, some people were saying they didn't even want to go back and replay the other games or play through this game again because of how devastating this ending was. It literally made you feel like everything that you had done in the previous games had been for nothing. That it was all a waste of time. Nobody wanted to enjoy these games anymore because they felt like they couldn't because of how bad the ending was. And this was one of the first times, it wasn't the last because other games would kind of follow this, where the ending would affect people's perception of the entire story and the entire series. And it's kind of been a continuous trend, hasn't it? Even years later. I mean, I can tell you that for a lot of people, the ending of Game of Thrones kind of, ruined the entire series for them. When you think about it, it certainly did for me. But that's a whole nother separate discussion topic. But like I said, Mass Effect 3 was really one of the first times I noticed that this was a gigantic problem where the ending of this story would dramatically ruin the entirety of the story for everyone else. And that's just, unfortunately, been a continuous thing, whether it's been in video games, movies, TV shows, books, you name it. It unfortunately has become a very large and magnified issue, and I couldn't help but always think of Mass Effect 3 when this was coming up, because it's just so easy to remember what it was like back then. The outcry was absolutely huge, and like I said, it went on for months. People were demanding that BioWare change it. Like, there was polls about how people felt about the ending, and the majority, overwhelmingly, was they hated it and they wanted BioWare to change it. And like I said, there were times where some people at BioWare were coming out trying to somewhat defend their decision, and it was just, there was no defending it. There wasn't. So later, they released a free DLC, and thank goodness it was free, because if it was paid DLC, people would have been even more irate. And I believe it was called the Extended Cut DLC, which tried to make the ending more of give it more of an actual epilogue. You know, like trying to help give you an idea of what the choice you made actually did. It tried to add more scenes, add more context to what was going on, because there were things throughout the final cutscene that made us go, what in the world is this? Why is this happening? And they tried to add extra scenes to give extra, context as to why that was happening, and make us go, oh, I see. And it somewhat helped, but it wasn't like a perfect, like, this is exactly what we wanted type of resolution to the problem. Future DLC content did come out for this as well, which gave more people more of a reason to play it. Like the Leviathan DLC, and of course, there was the Omega DLC, and then of course there was the Citadel DLC, which was the final bit of content, and the content that made BioWare go, that's it, we're done. We're done with Mass Effect 3, that's it, that's the final content, no more. And it really was intended to be like the final send-off, almost like a love letter to the series, but also, I guess, to the fans, even though the fans were still mad at BioWare. And some actually felt that, I know some people have felt that the Citadel DLC was kind of one of those content where they pushed out and they were like, here, leave us alone. just here's content, leave us alone. They wanted to get away from people demanding that they change things. And that's how some people felt the Citadel DLC was intended. And it's a real shame, because I remember at the time thinking that was a really nice, enjoyable piece of content that almost felt like a better ending than the actual endings we got. Oh, man. Ugh. Years later, as we approach the end of this past decade, going from 2019 into 2020, I remember some of us were kind of looking back at this past decade in gaming, looking at what were some of the good, what was some of the bad, and what was some of the disappointing. And every time the topic of disappointing or even bad came up, people were saying Mass Effect 3. Just without hesitation, Mass Effect 3, Mass Effect 3. Now, I've never considered Mass Effect 3 a bad game overall. There are things I said when we first did a playthrough of this game that I do still feel about, the same about. I don't feel like the entirety of the game is bad, like some people think. But then again, I'm one of those who doesn't think Dragon Age 2 is entirely all that bad compared to other people who think it's complete garbage. There are elements to this that are actually pretty decent. It's just there are other elements that either were not well handled or done in a way that people just didn't want to be done or handled. And you can also tell that some things were just off and different. The way some elements just feel in this just don't feel like they do in other games. It's been a reference and talked about as a consistency issue. And that is something that people want to address. And that's something I'm going to be talking about in a moment as well. But it just goes to show that almost a decade later, not counting the people that are just now going through this, though some are still working on actually finishing this. I mean, look at me. But then again, I'm someone who's played this before. Other people that you can find on YouTube that are experiencing the series for the first time, they've finished 2 and they're kind of still going through 3, or even have finished 3. And some, liked it for what it was. And I'm still waiting for some others to see whether or not they're going to have some kind of reaction. But then again, they're not going to get to experience the original ending of this, because the original ending is not part of this. The extended cut DLC that added the epilogue scenes and such, it just came with this edition. So it didn't let new players know what it was like when this first came out and the original ending. Now, there is a mod that actually, I couldn't believe this, there is a mod that actually will let you undo that DLC and let you see the original endings, though I can't for the life of me imagine why people would want that. Unless they just want to experience it, but at that point I would say, rather than put that mod in, just look up someone's video from when they did it back then. Because they are up there still. But almost a decade later, this is still regarded as one of the most disappointing games ever, because it absolutely did not live up to expectations, and it has gone down in history as a game with an ending that just people are still not happy with to this day. To the point where one of the first things that people wanted to try and do was change it and fix it. Now, as I said, I never got into actually modding the original games, mainly because I was playing on consoles at the time. You can't really do that on consoles unless, you're Bethesda and you're like, hey, you can do some mods on consoles, which is not really the same as modding on PC, but you guys get my point. So, it's been interesting going through the amount of mods that the modding community for this edition of the game has been creating and working on, and some are still working on. There are some mods that were made for the original versions of this game that they are trying to recreate for this edition, because, as you guys can probably understand, mods for a previous edition of a game are not really meant to work for a new edition or version of a game. There's a number of different coding and bug issues that can result from that. So, let's just say that for this run, I went a little mod crazy, as you can probably imagine. And as you can imagine, when it comes to mods for the 3 games, I think there is by far the most mods for this game. Like, there are mods for the first and second game, obviously. And I would expect it to be for the first game because of the amount of issues the first game had from a technical standpoint. But a lot of the mods for this have to do with basically restoring cut content, because there was quite a bit of content that was just outright cut for this because crunch time, and hey, we gotta cut that and get rid of that so we can be able to make our deadline to get this game out, because you guys know how often that unfortunately happens with places like EA. But anyways, it's been very interesting to look through the list of mods for this game. So, just to give you guys an idea, I went ahead and made... I tried to take a picture of the amount of mods that I'm using. There's a full-on mod manager specifically for the Mass Effect Legendary Edition. Actually, it's also for the original version of the game. It's I think it's the Mass Effect Mod Manager, I guess it's called. But it's been interesting also for this run that in the first game we didn't do any mods because I wasn't really sure how it was going to work out. Part of the way through the second game, we decided to go ahead and start doing some mods. So I was just kind of let you guys know about other mods I was picking up at the time. This time I'm just going to let you know we have a whole bunch of mods for this setup. And I'm going to let you guys know what some of those are. I took a couple pictures just to kind of remind myself of all the different mods I've got going on here, just for this game alone, not to mention the mods I've set up for the other 2 games. All bonus powers, the Audimus Happy Ending mod. That's right, I got a mod that's supposed to give us more of an actual happy ending. It's still being worked on, and it's also being worked on alongside another mod coming out later, which is supposed to help turn the Citadel DLC into more of an epilogue. I'm hoping that will work out just fine. I should also point out, even though I have all these mods, I haven't really tested this yet. And I'm really hoping this is not going to implode in my face and just have it be buggy and constantly crash and everything. I'm really hoping this is going to be a smooth run with mods. But it also should be noted there's a couple patches that were made specifically for that, but I'm getting to that in just a second. Collector's Cabin. It's supposed to add stuff in Shepard's cabin, which I like the idea of that he's just collecting, or she's just collecting things as she goes through her journeys. Expanded Galaxy mod, which is basically, I guess, for all 3 games. This one's fun. This is something I found that I'm hoping it's going to work out fine, though it's probably going to be a little awkward. I'm waiting to see how it's going to turn out when we get there. It won't be until we do the CL DLC way later. But it's FemShep versus BroShep Duel of the Shepherds. I'll let you guys think about that. It's the idea of that is pretty great. In fact, I believe Mark Meir actually helped come up with the idea of that mod, and a modder jumped on the idea of that to try and make it a reality. Fish plus Kelly, which is Kelly bringing me my fish without having to actually, take her out for dinner in the second game. The Harbinger Overhaul mod, you'll get to see him at least one extra time in this because of this mod. Immersive emails. This is supposed to be adding emails that were part of a app that was supposed to be a companion app for this game. Don't you remember when they did that? Like, hey, play this game and then use this app on your iPad or something like that. Yeah. So there was supposed to be a app that was supposed to be like a companion piece for this game that had these immersive emails. I don't think I ever had it, but this just adds it to our terminal in the game. Kirahi Makes Good. I believe that's supposed to help add some extra war assets on part of Kirahi. This is one of the big ones. The Legacy Edition 3 Community Patch and Framework. This is a big one. This has a whole bunch of tweaks and fixes when it comes to things like bugs and such that the devs just never took care of. And the community, because they are such a great, amazing group of passionate people who love these games that actually want to actually do this work on these games to make it as good as it can be, did a lot of that stuff. It's also supposed to be able to allow other mods to be able to work better for this game, because it would be kind of hard to do so without it. An opening remaster mod. We're going to get to see a slightly different intro for this game when we get underway. No Reapers and max scan range. So, you know how we would go around to the planets in the second game? In this game, we do so, but when we do so, we have Reapers show up and chase us around. That always irritated me. I got rid of that. That's what this mod does. Optional Flirting Mod for the third game. I had that in the second game. I think it's a really nice mod. That way you're not tricked or forced into a romance you don't want to. Oriana looks like Miranda's twin for this version. For this game, I mean. Padme's Cabin and Apartment Editions. More stuff to add into the apartment and the cabin. Phantom Introduction Mod, having to do with a cutscene that has Kai Lang. Ugh. Instead has us get introduced to the Phantom unit. Samara's new armor, which is supposed to have the same armor that I showed you guys in the previous game. Supposed to have it for this one as well. The security scan skip. So you remember that security screen that you had to stand in and have it scan you in order to actually get to the next room? Kind of a cover for a loading screen, I guess. Well, now I can just skip that, because it always bothered me. I had to stand there and just wait for it to finish scanning me before I can move on. Shepard can agree with Anderson. I found this interesting. The idea that rather than Shepard, when Anderson says, we have to go to the Citadel and talk to the Council, that Shepard immediately goes, the Citadel? The fight is here. That instead you can actually have an option to be like, yeah, sure, yeah, I'll go. The idea that, oh yeah, I'm going to stay here and fight by ourselves. So you want to die? Instead of get help? Silent Trainer, you know how I had that mod that's Silence Kelly in the second game? This one silences Trainer in the third game. The Spectre Expansion Mod. This is supposed to add some extra things in the Spectre terminal to give us some extra choices and such that a Spectre could be able to make. Some have positives, some have consequences. I found that interesting. Take Earth Back. It's an overhaul mod that's supposed to really help give the strong feeling that all the assets and everything that you have collected during your time in the games are now showing up here on Earth to help you fight back against the Reapers. And I just love that. So that's going to be something fun to see, especially when we get to see all the fleets and such, but we're going to ahead of ourselves. Unlimited Sprint. I wanted to kind of keep that around. And unrestricted weapon upgrades. Now, this is not the final list of mods that I will probably be using in this game. Like I said, there's another mod I'm waiting on, which is that Citadel Epilogue mod, which is supposed to go hand in hand with the Happy Ending mod. But it's still being worked on, so I'm just going to be patient and wait for that before that comes out. So, yeah, I think that's just about everything I want to talk about in regards to this game. Because it had to be addressed and talked about. You can't just skip over that kind of polarizing history and legacy when it comes to a game like this. So, I'm actually really looking forward to this, believe it or not. Even though this is Mass Effect 3, this is a modded version of Mass Effect 3 with a number of mods that I'm thinking and hoping are supposed to really help with the experience of this game. As usual, as I've learned, it's amazing how mods can just all of a sudden just refreshen the experience to make it feel as if you're playing a game you've never played before. Even if it is a game that you have played before, mods can just drastically change the experience. You know what I mean? I've never forgotten what Total Biscuit, may he rest in peace, said in his WTF's video of XCOM 2, where he was discussing mods. And one of the things he said was, modding is not the enemy. It's your friend. And he was sending that was directed towards developers and publishers, considering that there's quite a few that just are very anti-mod based on how they decide to design their games, where it becomes extremely difficult for people to actually mod them. And then you have games like Elder Scrolls or Fallout from studios like Bethesda who are like, yeah, go crazy with mods, have fun. You know, the people at Firaxis did the same thing with XCOM. And fortunately, it seems like they have been able to do so here with the Mass Effect Legendary Edition. Andromeda is a whole separate issue, which we will get to later. But let's just say that's more so on probably on the issue of the Frostbite engine that they decided to do for that one. But like I said, that's something we can get into when we eventually get to Andromeda, which probably won't be for quite some time. So, I figured that all this stuff was going to be its own separate video. I should have told you guys right from the beginning, just kind of sit down because there's not going to be any gameplay for this part. I figured there was just going to be a separate video of me just sitting here and talking about this because stuff had to be talked about, you know? It had to happen. So, consider this the Mass Effect 3 pre-talk part of this run. When we return, we'll be starting Mass Effect 3. Though more than likely what you're going to see next is the Dark Horse comic of Shepard recapping the events of the previous two games. And then the next part after that will be when we actually start the actual game. So, stay tuned for the recap of Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 1 told by Commander Shepard.